Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show David Haberman. David, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's good to be here. I appreciate this chance to speak with you.
Yeah, likewise. So I guess, for folks who don't know you already, a little bio is in order. You're a professor and former chair in the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. And you got your PhD in the History of Religions program from the University of Chicago, which is its own kind of thing I'd love to hear about. You teach courses on religion, ecology, environmentalism, and you're studied really broadly in religions, but a lot of your work focuses specifically on Hinduism, and you've spent several years doing ethnographic and textual research in India. Uh, and then your recent work is focused on worshipful interactions with natural forms of divinity in India, like rivers, trees, stones, and mountains. And so you have a lot of books on those topics, like River of Love and an Age of Pollution, which is about the Yamuna River, People Trees, Worship of Trees in Northern India, and recently, Loving Stones, Making the Impossible Possible in the Worship of Mount Govardhan. Govardhan? Govardhan? Butchered that terribly. But what I want to talk to you about now is the book that came out just a minute ago, right? Just like last week, Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Life Worlds. A really cool edited collection of essays that show how climate change is shaping religions while religions are trying to respond to climate change. So many things to talk about. But first and foremost, I want to hear about this book. It looks like a really wide-ranging variety of topics that are showing up here. So, what's the overall aim and scope of this project for you?
Yeah, so you're right. I've only been able to physically hold a copy of Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Life Worlds since the very beginning of this month. So I guess I received copies last week. This book is the culmination of several year research project that was initiated by the Center for Study of Latin American at American University. And it was, I think, a 3-year research project funded by a loose grant. And it involved a group of international scholars. And this is actually just one of 2 volumes that are coming out of that work. This is the first one, which is the anthropological case studies. But Evan Berry is editing a second volume that's going to look more at policy, policy changes, and religion. But the project focused primarily looking at glacier deterioration and related floods and storms that are happening increasingly in high mountainous areas, focusing particularly on the Andes in Peru and the Himalaya in India, and also looking at small island vulnerability in the face of climate change in the Caribbean and South Pacific. So that's kind of the range, and there's more involved in that. But the question is, what is happening with religion and climate change these days? And I think this is a growing field of study that many do see as an outgrowth of the field of religion and ecology. But some have suggested that because it's just such an overreaching concept effect that perhaps it's beginning to find a place of its own. But in many ways, it's a project that is arguing that in considering climate change issues, religion matters. Religion is something that really has a great deal to contribute to that. So in the ethnographic case studies, we're looking not only at how religions are responding to climate change related challenges, and there's the question, is climate change a singularity? And when we look at different cultural understandings of climate change, the answer in many ways, I think, to that question is no, that climate change itself is being interpreted through particular cultural lenses. And that means that any attempt at adaptation and mitigation are going to be conceived of in different ways in different parts of the world. And if we as a globe are going to be able to address and somehow effectively deal with climate change, we have to take those extremely local understandings of what climate change is very seriously. And it's also looking then at how climate change is affecting religious communities, both at the level of theological conceptions. We're seeing significant changes in religion due to climate change related challenges, as well as changes in ritual practices, the way those are thought about, and community formation. So religion is affecting people's understandings of climate change, and climate change is affecting religious transformations around the world today. I think those are, just in a general sense, the kind of issues that we're interested in. And it's also, again, just finding a more solid place at the table in global climate change discourse for religion. Scientists who are involved in studying climate change identify drivers of climate change. So we know burning of fossil fuels, et cetera, are labeled as major drivers of climate change. But what I think that many involved in the kind of project that manifests in a book like Understanding Climate Change through Religious Lifeworlds would argue that there are other major drivers of climate change, such as conceptions of self and worldviews, understanding of the nature of the world, and particularly the more than human world. Those are major drivers in climate change that are not really recognized in a lot of contemporary climate change discourse. Yeah, so I think it's looking at those kinds of issues generally.
Yeah, that's great. That's such an important point, because it's easy to just blame like the carbon. Like, you know what's making the climate warm? It's all that carbon. Like, well, who's putting it there? And there's values that are driving those actions. So sure, fossil fuel production, but then what are the worldviews and the understandings that are shaping all that? And I really like the attention to ethnographic detail too, because sometimes I think these discussions get a little lost in worldview and they lose on the ground community kind of, what's actually happening in specific locales. So I'm wondering if you have any examples of how people in any of those cases are changing rituals. What's an example of a ritual that's changed in response to the warming climate?
One of the chapters in the book focuses on changing rituals in the interaction with glacial mountains in the highlands of Peru. And I'm thinking of that one in particular for ritual changes, and I'll maybe give a second example, but sticking with this one for a moment, that offerings have been made to the Apu, the deity of a glacial mountain, and those offerings are now regarded in a different way. So there's an attention to the environmental effect of those offerings. So the offerings, there are changes in the way they're offered, but there are also changes in the way the offerings themselves are regarded. So just in the ritual interaction with the Apu, these glacial deities, we see changes. Maybe shifting to the Tibetan Plateau up in the Indian Himalayas in the western state of Ladakh. There's a chapter that is focusing on rituals, again, that are interacting with mountain deities. But the I think one of the things that's tracked in the book too is how globalization is radically transforming the entire world and in a sense undermining local traditions and local practices and changing them. So that at a time when the anxiety level around climate change is calling for those traditional ways of addressing anxiety. At that very time, the ritual ways of addressing that kind of anxiety are being undermined, and ritual specialists are harder and harder to find. So there's one of looking at a ritual that is addressing the anxieties of the people in the face of droughts that are happening on the Tibetan plateau there also. The rituals seem to have a sense of failure. So there's an increasing sense that perhaps the traditional ways are needed, and yet perhaps even they are not enough to deal with some of the new problems that are arising for local communities in the face of climate change to even deal with those challenges. So anxiety, a sense of loss, a sense of uncertainty, these are issues that come up a great deal. And I'm not sure a lot of the literature on religion and climate change have addressed those. So I think you're right in pointing out the difference of anthropological case studies to former studies of religion and climate change, which have tended to be, not solely, but to a large degree, have tended to be normative assertions of positions toward climate change rather than looking at the actual struggles going on, or have tended to focus on whether a particular religious tradition is an obstacle to dealing with climate change or a resource for dealing with it. And that's an important question. But these other issues of how to deal with the anxiety, the uncertainty, the loss that is occurring for many within their communities around the planet.
Yeah, that's really difficult. I've heard more and more people talking about eco anxiety and climate anxiety. So it seems like that the very idea that that's a problem is only starting to really come into view for a lot of people. And even in like the community of psychologists and sociologists, they're still not quite sure if eco anxiety is a valid concept. Meanwhile, if you go around the world, people are like, no, we're feeling it. I can't imagine how profound it is to be making offerings to a glacial deity when the glacier is melting. That's a level of mourning that's really hard to comprehend. Um,
Well, so there's another theme that comes out of the book, and that is a fear of an abandonment by the gods in the world that we are living in. So that connection between humans and gods is a connection that I think we see being tracked in very different ways by religious communities.
right. Yeah, and to see that in that kind of international perspective too, that this isn't just happening in a couple places, kind of happening everywhere. I'm curious about more of the low-lying areas, like places that are going to be threatened with sea level rise. What are some of the things that were coming up there? Some of the common themes or patterns?
Well, they're not going to be, but are now currently
Mm,
threatened by rising sea levels and increasing hurricanes.
right.
There's two articles in the volume that focus on Oceania or South Pacific area, and there Christianity has a strong presence, but it's a localized form of Christianity that in some cases is a hybrid with more traditional cultures that have been there much longer than Christianity has been. So I think one of the things I noticed as editor of this volume and just looking at the 10 chapters from a comparative perspective is that there's what I call kind of a double agency in climate change within religious context. For climate scientists, there is the primary agency is human. So we talk about anthropogenic climate change. And it's what we as human beings are doing that are causing the climate change that we are witnessing today. That's not denied. It's seen in different ways. That's not denied. But in addition to that, there's another layer of agency, and that is the divine layer of agency. And this is where another common theme that I saw as editor of the volume and just looking at it from a comparative perspective is this notion of the anger of the gods, or the anger of God. So that climate change is seen, there's a close relationship between humans, gods, and the land or the environment. And that somehow the responses that are happening are not just, they are responses, moral responses are on the part of human beings that are causing the problem. That is kind of an immorality is causing the problem. But then the divine response, so that the storms, the sea levels rising, to use the example of the case of the South Pacific, are understood as being a punishment of God, or a manifestation of the anger of God, so that there's a rupture in that tripartite relationship between the environment, God or gods, and humans. And so that's the problem, is the rupture of that relationship, whether it's seen as a disrespecting of the land, disrespecting of peoples, or disrespecting of the gods of the land, or disrespecting God in some form. It's that disrespect and the disconnect in the relationship that is often regarded as a problem. And so that, yeah, something like sea level rise, or the floods that are coming, that are driving people off the coastal regions in many of these islands, does have an element of divine agency behind it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's really profound. I think rethinking and redistributing agency is so crucial for understanding all kinds of environmental problems. Because if part of the issue is that humans have been a little anthropocentric, then if we're still diagnosing the problem with that anthropocentrism, we only see agency really in the human, we're not going to understand the full complexity of what's happening. And especially, yeah, if you're trying to respond to climate change, if there's things like rising sea levels or stronger storms, and then your response feels like it's met by angry gods, then you're going to lose any moral ground for action at that point, it seems.
Well, it's not, the response has to be one that takes in reestablishing that relationship, a more reverent relationship with the land, or with the deities of the land, or with the divine somehow conceived. So the response is that. And in a way, I was also interested in just looking at the chapters from a collective perspective, in how there is, one of the questions is, what is the relationship between a religious perspective, or religious perspectives, and a scientific or scientific perspectives on climate change? And in some cases, I think this issue of double agency really gets a great difference. So science wants to remain within talking about human causes. So there's a single agency, and that's why I call it a double agency. That's not denied, but there is that divine element added. So what's the relationship between the two? And I think there is an interesting and significant overlap. And I think it comes from what I often call the if clause, so that scientists put out warnings after warnings that if we don't change our behavior in the world, we are looking at a catastrophic future. But if we make changes in specific ways, there's hope. That's not uncommon to find that discourse or narrative in scientific literature. That also is present in many of the ethnographic studies that are in this volume, in that if we don't change our ways, then catastrophic future awaits us. That's agreed upon, but how that is seen and what that means. So if we change our ways, but changing our ways could involve um, an increased morality within human community or human to human interaction. It could mean um, developing or returning to a more respectful relationship with the gods of the land, or it could mean respecting gods in a particular way. It's that, but I think where the overlap comes in is where this is tied into the environment. So respecting the gods of the land, which is a concept present in many of the chapters, is the way of returning to a more harmonious relationship with the more than human world. And I think that's where scientists could sign on to that. The explanation for it or how one gets there might be different, but I think it's what is shared is that notion of a more respectful, harmonious relationship with the more than human world, because I think climate change is one of those factors that is really telling us we've got that one wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, right. If there's anything that's telling us loud and clear. Yeah, I like that way of thinking. I mean, the science religion dialogue is just so challenging and so fraught. That seems like a constructive way to bring those kinds of changes into dialogue with what scientists are saying. Otherwise, it's things like, you know, just reduce our energy consumption, technical solutions, maybe some economic policies. But if they're not thinking about changing our relationship to the divine or to our moral ground, then we're really missing a big source of our motivation for making positive change. I
Right.
wonder if are there any of these stories have like rays of hope or any of them really positive? It's there's not a lot of good news on the climate change front.
So there, I think we're again in the territory of religion, more than science, because hope, scientists do talk about hope in their messages in ways, but they're a little uneasy with what that means. Whereas hope has a natural home in religious discourse. I would say that in some sense they all do, because that if clause, the hope is if we make certain changes, then there's a much more positive future on the horizon. But without that, then disaster awaits us. So I think that is always there in all of the chapters, um, because that in itself is tied to motivational factors. If there was no hope whatsoever, then any kind of effective mitigation then is not going to take place. But I think what also struck me is that none of us have any idea what the ultimate outcome is going to be. No one has a crystal ball. So however we engage in the world today, we do with some sense of hope, because right, that is the human situation, I think, in many conditions, but I think clearly here we're looking at that. I, I mean, I'm not sure, when I was just reading these chapters again as an aggregate, I'm not sure exactly what they're saying. And sometimes I think what those chapters do is document the human struggle with a situation in which we might ultimately be doomed. And in some sense, to me, that's still valuable. But that's in a kind of an extreme view. That's if somehow humans aren't able to make some kind of transformation in our relationship with the world we inhabit, um, or the world that is us, however we think about that in so many ways, and the way we conceptualize ourselves in relationship with what we call the world is so much at the center of all this. But just how to live in that kind of uncertainty, how to find the strength to take a stand in any positive way, that's determined by local culture and local religious frameworks. And that became more apparent to me too. So it could be that the hopeful scenario was the one that will win out, and that religion is a factor that got us there. But in a less hopeful in terms of outcome scenario, religion seems to be functioning in a very significant way in helping people cope with the world that we're experiencing today.
Right. Right. That's yeah, it's like the uncertainty is so difficult to navigate, and yet that's also a source of so much possibility because humans are such an uncertain factor, right? So it's like so much of, climate science, like, well, it looks like we're headed toward doom, but luckily there's so much uncertainty, right? Luckily there's so much potential for humans to still make those changes. And even if we can't, to at least provide coping mechanisms and strategies for handling that kind of grief and anxiety. And yeah, that's that's really great. I'm looking forward to reading this. I know my copy's on the way. I think I was one of the last to get the pre-order in. I'm like, how's it taking so long? Um, but
So
geez, what wonder if you have any kind of final thought for us about this, because I also want to talk to you about, some of your other work. But if there's any other, kind of last concluding point, that anything that really was striking you in editing this volume.
I think it's that one size does not fit all. And in a lot of the religion and climate change discourse, the language of stewardship arises. And that makes sense within certain religious traditions. But I think it would be mistaken to assume that stewardship is the right language or lens to regard religious ways of coping with or addressing in positive ways climate change. So that I think for the more Abrahamic traditions that tend to understand more of a divide between divinity and the world, stewardship model is very effective and makes sense. But the all 10 chapters in the book focus on the global South. And even where Christianity is present, it's often combined with more local religious traditions that do see divinity more embedded in the land itself. And then in those traditions that, and I'm thinking in the traditions that are looked at with in Hindu India or Buddhist traditions in the Himalayan region, the divinity is much more embedded in the land, and that's why I use the phrase gods of the land. So there, the language of understanding the challenges of climate change and the ways of coping with it, mitigation, adaptation, all those sorts of issues, I think are seen in a different light. And it just comes back to understanding religion in its complexity, so that we don't really talk about religion, we talk about religions. And even in something like Hinduism, it's not Hinduism, it's
Right.
Hinduisms.
Right.
So it's somehow taking on in creative ways the necessary weaving between extremely local traditions and the global climate crises that we are seeing more and more of today.
Wonderful. That's so well said. Thank you so much. And I think that'll be a good spot to kind of pause and conclude this episode, and then we'll be back next week, right, with the second half of this interview, because you just opened up exactly a distinction I really appreciate, which is the difference between the Abrahamic religions and then the religions of northern India that you're so familiar with. So we'll pause there, and then we'll be back for more next week. So bye bye for now, everybody.